The egg had been found in the rubble of a collapsed colony dome on a dead moon. Nobody knew how it got there. Nobody knew how long it had been sitting in the dark, alone in the cold. What they did know was that it was a Vethara egg, and that made it the most politically sensitive object in the entire sector. So they wrapped it in thermal cloth, put it on the first available diplomatic vessel, and tried very hard not to drop it. It hatched 4 days into the journey. The hatchling was small, smaller than anyone expected, with pale gold scales that caught the light and scattered it in slow, amber pieces across the walls of the environmental bay. Her wings were barely formed. Her eyes, when she opened them, were the color of deep water. Elder Suveth, the Vethara liaison assigned to oversee the transport, named her Solen. He said it meant something like one who arrives quietly. He said baby dragons of her kind should sleep for most of the journey, sedated by the low hum of a ship's drive and the warmth of a proper nesting pod. Solen did not get that message. She woke up 11 times in the first week, not fully, just enough to shift, to lift her head, to look at the walls of her pod with an expression that Suveth could only describe as searching. Then she would drop back to sleep. Suveth filed 3 incident reports. The ship's medic, a calm Shavari named Ossa, ran every biological scan available and reported that Solen was healthy, fed, and showing no signs of distress. She was simply waking up. That was all. By the 3rd week, it had stopped being interesting and started being exhausting. She slept through a solar flare alarm that rattled every loose fitting on the ship. She slept through a navigation drill so loud that 2 crew members on the upper deck could not hear each other speak. She slept through a hull microbreach alert that pulled everyone else from their bunks at 3 in the ship's morning. The whole crew of 17 was running drills and checking seals, and Solen was curled in her pod with her nose tucked under her tail, completely still. Suveth told the captain it was unusual. The captain, a broad-shouldered Drovian named Feld, told Suveth that unusual was putting it politely. Nobody thought to ask Owen Reyes. Owen Reyes was not the kind of person people thought to ask about things. He was the environmental systems officer, the human, the only one on the crew, and his job was to make sure the ship breathed. Air recyclers, heat routing, hydroponics pressure, the systems that kept everyone alive in the background, invisible, unremarkable. He was good at it. He was quiet about it. He ate alone, worked alone, and at the end of each shift he wrote short, plain notes in the maintenance log and went to sleep. He had been on the aerial Dawn for 2 years. Most of the crew still nodded at him the way people nod at furniture that has never been in the way. It was during a late shift check of the environmental bay that he first saw Solen. He had not known she was in there. He came through the side access panel to check a humidity sensor mounted on the far wall, and when he turned around with his scanner, there she was curled in her pod, one golden eye half open, watching him. He stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other for a moment. Owen said, in the calm, flat voice he used when he was thinking out loud, "Well, you are not a humidity sensor." He pulled up a crate and sat down a few feet from the pod, not approaching, not touching. He did not know anything about dragons. He did know that strange creatures in enclosed spaces generally did not like being crowded. He started working on his scanner report, talking quietly as he went, describing the humidity readings, noting that the air exchange on this deck ran 2 degrees warmer than optimal, explaining that he would flag it in the morning log. Just words. Just his voice moving through the quiet. Solen's eye drifted closed. By the time he filed his notes and left, she was sound asleep. He logged it as hatchling restless, self-resolved, and did not think about it again. He came back the next night because the humidity sensor needed a second calibration. Solen woke up when he came in, watched him, and went back to sleep when he started talking. He came back the night after that because there was a pressure reading he wanted to double-check. Same result. He did not notice the pattern. He was focused on the pressure readings. 3 weeks into the journey, the aerial Dawn entered an unmapped debris field at the edge of the transit corridor. It was not dangerous, just dense enough to trigger the automated warning system. Every alarm on the ship fired at once. Red light flooded every corridor. The sound was enormous, layered, designed by several species working together to create the most universally attention-grabbing noise possible. In the environmental bay, Solen did not move. 3 decks above her and half a corridor away, Owen looked up from the conduit panel he was rewiring, listened to the wall of noise for a moment, and said to himself, "Huh, that is loud." He said it quietly, he said it to no one. In the bay below, Solen's head lifted from her tail. Her deep-water eyes opened fully. Her nose turned, with slow and total precision, toward the direction of his voice. Suveth called the crew meeting at the 6th hour of ship's morning, which was not a time most species on the aerial dawn preferred for bad news. He stood at the head of the common room table with his long fingers folded in front of him and the careful expression of a person about to say something that could not be unsaid. The crew filed in slowly, Drovians, Yethric, Shavari, 2 Mulvaney engineers, and finally Owen, who came in last because he had been in the middle of recalibrating a water line and finished it before walking over. Suveth waited until everyone was seated. Then he said, "Solen has formed a pre-bond." The room went quiet in a way that had texture to it. Pre-bond, Suveth explained, was a biological event. During a hatchling's early sleep cycles, the Vethara nervous system was searching for warmth, for stability, for what the old language called the correct presence. It was not a choice in the way that choices were made with thought. It was the body choosing before the mind was fully awake. If it found what it needed, it began to build a link, not a full bond that took years and required both parties to acknowledge it openly, but the beginning. The root of one. He paused. He said, "It is not supposed to happen with a non-Vethara." Feld leaned forward. "Has it ever?" 3 times in recorded history. All 3 cases involved species with lifespans measured in centuries. Suveth glanced around the table. "I need to know who has been spending time near the hatchling." Everyone looked at everyone else. The answer was, essentially, no one. Suveth had been checking on her. Ossa had run her medical scans. The rest of the crew had treated the environmental bay as something between a restricted area and a problem they were glad was not their department. Then someone looked at Owen. Owen looked back at them. He said, "I was checking the humidity sensor and the pressure line and the air exchange. The whole deck runs warm. I mentioned it in the log." Feld said, "How many times did you go in there?" Owen thought about it. 8, 9, I lose count. The silence after that was a different kind. Suveth asked Owen to stay after the others left. He asked him to describe exactly what he did during those visits. Owen described it plainly. He came in through the side access. He worked on the sensors. He talked through his readings because it helped him organize his thoughts. He had not touched the pod. He had not tried to interact with Solen in any deliberate way. He genuinely had not thought it was relevant enough to mention. Suveth listened to all of this with an expression Owen could not quite read. When Owen finished, Suveth said, "You spoke to her." "I spoke near her. I was talking to myself." The distinction, Suveth said slowly, may not have been clear to her nervous system. Owen did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Feld's solution was simple and immediate. Owen was to stay away from the environmental bay. This was a diplomatic transport. Concordat regulations required the hatchling be delivered without interference to the bonding process. If a pre-bond was forming, the only responsible action was to remove the source before it deepened. Owen agreed without argument. He agreed so easily that Feld spent 30 seconds waiting for a protest that never came, and then had nothing to do with the silence except dismiss the meeting. Solen woke up 6 times in the next 8 hours. Each time Ossa checked on her. Each time she was biologically stable, no fever, no distress, no injury. Just awake, just searching. She would settle for a few minutes, then start again. She did not sleep properly once. The 7th time, Owen happened to be working in the corridor outside the bay, running a diagnostic on the deck's ventilation trunk. He was not thinking about Solen. He was annoyed about a flow rate discrepancy and said so to the panel in his usual quiet way. Through the wall, Solen went still. Within 3 minutes, she was fully asleep. Ossa, who had been watching the biosigns on her scanner, stared at the readout for a long time. Then she walked to the corridor and told Owen what had just happened. Owen looked at the ventilation panel. He said, "I was talking to the vent." "I know," Ossa said. "That is not the same as talking to her." "I know," Ossa said again, in a tone that meant she was no longer sure that distinction mattered. Suveth found Owen that evening in the mess room. He sat across from him and was quiet for a moment, which seemed to be a habit with him. Then he said, in the deliberate way of someone who had chosen each word before arriving, "You are the most unaware, important person I have encountered in 200 years." Owen looked up from his food. He considered this. Is that a compliment? "I am still deciding," Suveth said. Owen nodded slowly and said, "Well, thank you, I think." Suveth watched him finish his meal in silence. Owen did not seem troubled by the silence. He did not fill it with questions or jokes or nervous noise. He just sat there, eating, present and unhurried, the way he always was. Suveth thought about Solen in her pod. He thought about what the pre-bond meant biologically and what it meant that it had chosen this particular human. He was still thinking about it when the ship's comm crackled and the navigation officer said, in a very careful voice, that an unidentified vessel had matched their heading and was not broadcasting a Concordat transponder code. The other ship was big, not military big, but close enough that the difference did not matter much when there were weapons charged and no Concordat flag in sight. It identified itself as belonging to something called the Reclamation Syndicate. The voice on the comm was calm, which Feld found more unsettling than shouting. Calm voices during unscheduled intercepts meant people who had done this before. The syndicate's representative explained, without any particular urgency, that the Vethara had too much political weight in the Concordat, and that the next generation of dragons should not be allowed to cement that weight further. The hatchling aboard the aerial Dawn was, in their view, a political asset being illegally transporting. They wanted her transferred to a neutral holding facility. Feld said that was not going to happen. The syndicate gave them 4 hours to reconsider. The bridge went into controlled chaos after that, which was what trained crews did instead of regular chaos. Feld pulled the tactical Drovians to weapons assessment. The Yethric communications officer, Dret, began trying to raise Concordat patrol channels. Ossa went to the environmental bay to check Solen's status and came back to report that the hatchling was, somehow, still asleep. Suveth went pale, which was not easy given his naturally grey complexion. He told Feld that if the syndicate boarded the ship and Solen woke to strangers handling her pod, the result would not be safe for anyone involved. A hatchling in a pre-bond state, disturbed by unknown presences, would not simply cry, she would call. And a Vethara call, even from a hatchling, did things to the biology of nearby creatures that Feld did not want documented on his ship. Feld told Suveth to make sure that did not happen. Suveth said, with a look that communicated considerable restraint, that he was going to need Owen for that. Nobody loved this idea. Feld loved it least of all, but the alternative, Solen waking in a crisis, without the one presence her nervous system had decided was correct, was medically and diplomatically worse. He told Suveth to keep Owen away from the bridge and away from anything that would put him in the way of actual danger. Owen was a civilian crew member with a maintenance qualification. He was not a resource to be spent. Owen, when found, was already in the lower decks. He was not looking for something to do. He had a panel open on the port side thermal vent housing, and he was studying the power allocation readout with the focused quiet of a person working a puzzle he found genuinely interesting. Suveth told him what was happening. Owen listened without interrupting. When Suveth finished, Owen said, "Can I ask something about the syndicate ship's approach vector?" Suveth blinked. Yes. Are they coming in from the debris field side or clear space?" "Clear space. They want a direct boarding lane." Owen nodded slowly. He looked back at the thermal vent readout. He said, "The debris field behind us, is it still dense enough to scatter a passive drive signal?" Suveth did not know. Owen told him to ask Dret on the bridge. Suveth asked. Dret checked and said yes, the field was dense enough to scatter most passive emissions for about 40 minutes before they cleared its shadow. Owen said, "Okay," and kept working. Suveth waited for more. Maury did not come. He said, "Owen, what are you doing?" Owen said, "If we can make our drive signature look like it is failing, power dropping, thermal output inconsistent, the syndicate will think we are already damaged. If they think we are damaged, they will adjust their approach. They will not want to be in the debris lane if we drift into it. That gives Dret a clean angle to punch the patrol beacon through without our own hull blocking the signal. Right now, we are sitting between the beacon's best direction and where the patrol channels are actually listening." Suveth stood very still for a moment. He said, "That is a navigation problem." "It is a heat management problem," Owen said. "I can make the thermal vents fluctuate on a cycle. It will read like a drive fault from the outside." He said it the way he said everything, plainly, without performance, as if he was explaining a slightly inconvenient pipe issue. Suveth went back to the bridge. He told Feld. Feld stared at the thermal vent schematic Owen had sent up and said, "He wants to fake a breakdown using the heating system." "Yes." Feld looked at the schematic for another moment. Then he said, "Tell him to do it quietly and not blow anything up." Owen, informed of this, said he would try. He stopped by the environmental bay on his way back to the vent housing. He did not go inside. He stood at the door and spoke toward the pod in the same unhurried tone he used for everything. He said Solen should rest. He said he had something to fix, and he was going to go fix it. He said everything was all right. He said it the way he talked to the recyclers. In the doorway behind him, Suveth stood and watched and said nothing. Owen left. Suveth stayed for a moment longer, looking at the small golden shape curled in the pod. Solen had not moved. Her breathing was slow and even. Her ear, still soft at the edges, still growing into itself, was tilted toward the door. Toward the sound of Owen's footsteps walking away. On the bridge, Dret reported that the syndicate ship had just finished powering its forward weapons array. The 4 hours were not going to last 4 hours. The thermal vent trick worked for 11 minutes. Owen had the vents cycling on a fault pattern that looked, from the outside, like a drive coil failing on the port side. The aerial Dawn's drive signature went uneven and strange, and on the syndicate ship's sensors, it painted a picture of a vessel already in trouble. They adjusted their approach. They moved wide of the debris lane, just as Owen had expected, and that opened the angle Dret needed to push the patrol beacon signal through the clearest part of the channel. Dret sent the beacon. The beacon found a relay. The relay began looking for a patrol ship. That was the 11 minutes. Then the syndicate apparently decided that a damaged ship was easier to board, not a reason to wait, and fired a warning shot across the aerial Dawn's port side that was close enough to be a threat and direct enough to be a promise. It hit a secondary relay housing, not catastrophic, but the ship lurched, a sharp sideways flex that knocked 2 people off their feet on the bridge, and the power reroute Owen had built for the thermal vent cycle snapped under the surge like a dry branch. He felt it go, a hard physical shock through the panel he was holding, and the heat came back up through the casing faster than it should have. He pulled his hand away, but not quite fast enough. He exhaled, just once, short and sharp, through the corridor comm pickup that was open for his line check. 3 decks below. In the environmental bay, Solen's eyes opened. Not halfway, not in the slow, searching way she had been waking up for weeks. All the way, fully. Her head came up off her tail and turned with a precision that had nothing to do with sight. Her nostrils opened. Her entire small body oriented itself toward the sound of that one brief exhale the way a compass needle finds north. Something happened in the air. It was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was a sound that seemed to go through the floor rather than across it. A low, sustained hum that came from somewhere in Solen's chest and moved outward through her scales, through the pod casing, through the environmental bay walls, and into the ship's metal bones. Suveth, who had gone back to the bridge after leaving the environmental bay, stopped mid-sentence. He turned to Feld and said, very quietly, "Nobody move suddenly." Feld said, "What is that sound?" Suveth said, "She is calling." The crew felt it before they understood it. Not all species had the same response. The Drovians went still, the Yethric comm officer put a hand on the console and kept it there, and one of the Mulvaney engineers sat down in a corridor because his legs stopped working correctly and he did not know why. It was not pain, it was not fear exactly. It was something older than both, something that lived below thinking, below language, in the part of a living creature that understood only presence and absence, safety and threat. Solen was calling the one she had chosen. She was telling everything in range that something had interrupted him and she needed it not to be interrupted. On the syndicate ship, the boarding team that had been organizing near the docking port found that 3 of their members had sat down. 2 were crying, which none of them could explain afterward. The pilot had both hands on the controls but was not moving them, staring at nothing. Suveth understood what was happening. A Vethara prebond resonance was not a weapon. It was not meant to be. It was a hatchling's biological call to her bonded adult, come back, come here, something is wrong. But the nervous systems of most species, when they encountered it, did not know that. They felt it as a directive, wordless and ancient and impossible to argue with. Stay still, do not be a threat. The little one is calling and you will not interfere. Owen did not hear any of this analysis. Owen was in the corridor outside the environmental bay because that was the fastest route between the vent housing and the secondary relay he needed to check next. He heard the sound. He stopped walking. He stood outside the bay door. He went in. He did not run. He pulled the crate to where it had been before and sat down beside the pod. Solen was standing upright inside it, all 4 legs, her wings half spread, her golden scales dimmed to something close to amber. She was small. She was very, very small, and she was vibrating with something that was too large for her body yet. Owen put his hand flat against the outside of the pod casing, not through the door, not touching her, just his palm against the metal where she was closest. He said, "Hey, I burned my hand a little on the conduit. It is fine. The conduit is fixed." He paused. "The ship is all right. You can sleep." Solen stopped vibrating. The resonance dropped. It did not fade. It just stopped, like a switch. The Mulvaney engineer in the corridor blinked and stood up and did not know why he had sat down. On the syndicate ship, the boarding team looked at each other with expressions that would take them several days to describe accurately. Solen pressed her nose against the inside of the pod casing, directly where Owen's hand was. She held it there. She breathed out once, slow and long, and then she was asleep again. 40 minutes later, a Concordat patrol vessel arrived. The syndicate ship left without another word. Suveth spent most of the next 2 days on long-range communications that he did not describe to the rest of the crew in detail. He sat in the small conference room with the door closed and spoke in low, careful Vethara to a screen that showed faces Owen had never seen. When he came out, he looked tired in the way of someone who had been doing mathematics that refused to come out even. He told Feld the situation privately. Feld came out of that meeting and told no one anything, but he stopped asking Owen to stay away from the environmental bay. Nobody said it out loud, but the shape of things had changed. Owen noticed the crew treating him differently, not with hostility, something quieter than that. The Drovian tactical officer, whose name was Brev and who had spoken to Owen directly maybe 4 times in 2 years, left a sealed cup of ship-brewed tea outside the door of the environmental bay one morning without explanation. Dret, who had been the most skeptical voice on the bridge during the beacon plan, stopped looking past Owen in corridors and started looking at him. Even Ossa, who was professionally neutral about most things, had begun updating him on Solen's condition without being asked. Solen had eaten 3 full meals in 2 days. She had not missed a sleep cycle. Her biosigns were the best Ossa had recorded since the transport began. Owen came by during his maintenance rounds. Solen watched him through the pod screen. When he talked, she tracked the sound. When he left, she settled. It was not complicated to observe. It had simply not been observed before. On the final transit day before the Vethara system, Suveth asked Owen to come to the environmental bay and sit with him. Not to do anything, just to sit. Suveth explained what a Vethara bond meant. He used careful words and did not rush. He said it was not ownership, and it was not like a pet, and it did not mean that Solen could not eventually form other relationships or travel or live a full Vethara life. What it meant was that she would seek Owen out, across distance, across time, across the quiet in between. She had written his presence into her biology while she was still forming, and that could not be unwritten. He said, in practice, the bond is not considered complete until both parties speak it plainly. Owen looked at Solen. She was watching him from inside the pod. She had her chin resting on the rim of the opening, and her deep-water eyes were entirely focused on his face. She was not performing attention. She was just attending, the way young things attend to the one thing they have decided is worth attending to. Owen said, "Does she have a choice in this?" Suveth said she had already made her choice. That was the bond. Owen said, "Do I?" Suveth was quiet for a moment. He said that under Concordat law, the bond was recognized regardless, but in Vethara culture, an unacknowledged bond from the non-Vethara side was considered incomplete, not invalid, but unfinished. He said, "It is considered respectful to speak it if you mean it." Owen was quiet too for a while. He looked at Solen. She looked at him. Around them the ship hummed, and the recyclers turned, and the air moved in its slow, patient cycle the way it always did. Owen said, plainly and without any ceremony at all, "That is fine by me then." Solen put her chin down on her tail and was asleep in under a minute. Suveth stood up, said, "Excuse me," and went into the corridor for several minutes. When he came back, his composure was fully intact. He did not explain where he had been. The message from the Vethara High Council arrived that evening. Suveth read it twice. He came to find Owen in the upper cargo bay where he was replacing a vent seal, and he read him the relevant section. The council had recognized the bond as valid. Owen Reyes, Environmental Systems Officer of the GSV Aerial Dawn, was formally acknowledged as the bondholder of a Vethara hatchling, under the protection and recognition of the High Council of the Vethara. He would be received with full honors upon arrival. Owen asked what full honors meant. Suveth said it meant a formal delegation, a session with the High Council, and a reception in the primary bonding hall that had not been opened for a non-Vethara visitor in over 400 years. Owen said, "Do I need a different uniform for that?" Suveth looked at him for a long moment. He said, "I genuinely do not know how to answer that question." Owen said his current one had a small burn mark on the cuff from the conduit incident. He could see if Ossa had a repair kit. Suveth said that would probably be sufficient. The Aerial Dawn dropped out of transit the next morning. The Vethara homeworld filled the forward view screen, vast and ancient, its surface moving with slow geological light, amber and gold and deep orange in long, sweeping bands, like a world that was still deciding what shape it wanted to settle into. Owen had come to the bridge for the first time in the whole journey. He stood at the back, near the door, and looked at the view screen. He said it was very pretty. Every crew member on the bridge turned to look at him with an expression he recognized as the same one Suveth had been wearing for 3 days. He did not know what the expression meant. He decided not to ask. The planet turned slowly in the light of its star. Below, a delegation was preparing to receive them. The docking hall was built for creatures larger than anything Owen had been in a room with before. The ceilings were high enough that the upper parts were in slow shadow, lit by long channels of amber stone that radiated heat the way sunlit rock does, deep and even and old. The floor was smooth and warm under his boots. The delegation that met the Aerial Dawn at the base of the ramp was 12 Vethara, each of them between 3 and 5 times the size of a human, each of them going completely still the moment Owen stepped down with Solen at his side. Solen was walking, not gracefully, her legs were still short and her coordination was still settling into itself, but she walked, and she stayed close to Owen's ankle, and she did not look at any of the 12. She looked at the floor in front of her and occasionally up at Owen's face, checking that he was still there. Owen had put a repair patch on the burn mark on his cuff. He was wearing his regular uniform. He had not been able to find a better one. Suveth spoke quietly in his ear, giving him names and context as the delegation's head stepped forward. Her name was Orith. She was Solen's great matriarch, the eldest of the bloodline, old enough that the record of her birth was kept in a script that only 4 living scholars could read. She was enormous. She moved with the slow certainty of something that had never once in its life needed to hurry. Orith looked at Owen for a long moment. Then she lowered her head until her chin nearly touched the stone floor. Suveth said very quietly that this was the deepest formal acknowledgement in Vethara custom, reserved for those who had sheltered the bloodline. He said Owen should bow his head in return if he wanted to respond correctly. Owen bowed his head. Orith made a sound deep in her chest. Suveth translated it, after a pause, as the Vethara equivalent of, "Yes, that is exactly what I thought." The High Council session was held the next morning. The chamber was ancient and warm, carved from the same amber stone as everything else on this world, and full of scholars who had been studying Vethara bonding for decades and had never expected to be sitting across from a human asking them to explain it. They asked Owen many questions. He answered them plainly. No, he had not known what he was doing. Yes, he talked to things while he worked, always had, since he was a child taking apart appliances in his parents' house and narrating the process to himself because it helped him think. No, he did not find this strange. It was just how he organized his thoughts. A council member asked him why a person would speak to a machine as though it were listening. Owen thought about it. He said, I think everything deserves to know it is working all right. The chamber was very quiet after that. The scholars began to reconstruct what had happened from Owen's answers. A hatchling in transit distress, not measurable as crisis, too subtle for instruments, just the low biological unease of a young creature forming in an unfamiliar place with no anchor. And in the surrounding decks, a human who was, by habit and temperament, producing exactly the acoustic and biological profile a Vethara nervous system was tuned to receive. Not power, not greatness, steadiness. A voice that did not react, did not startle, did not add noise to the air. One of the scholars said, quietly, that in 2,000 years of recorded history, every being who had ever bond-held a Vethara hatchling outside the species had shared one quality. The quality had no concordat standard word. In old Vethara, it translated imperfectly as one who does not make the air louder when they enter it. A concordat diplomatic observer in the corner raised a hand and asked whether they could get a formal definition of that phrase for the official record. The council said they would try, but they did not think it would translate well. The resolution came quickly, which Suveth told Owen later was not how the Vethara Council usually operated. The bond was formally recognized. Solen would remain with Owen. The aerial Dawn would be reassigned as an environmental research vessel in Vethara territory for the foreseeable future. Owen would continue as environmental systems officer. The arrangement suited everyone because Solen was already bonded to a ship that had working recyclers she apparently liked, and Owen was already employed on that ship doing work he was good at, and none of this required anyone to be unhappy about anything. Feld's reply, when informed by official communique, was, "You owe me a very long explanation." Owen wrote back, "The Deck 4 recyclers need replacing anyway. I can explain while I work." That evening Owen sat on a warm stone ledge outside the guest hall, looking at the mountains. The geological light moved across them slowly, orange and amber, shifting in deep unhurried bands. Solen was curled against his side. She was already bigger than she had been a week ago. In 10 years, she would be larger than the aerial Dawn. In 100, she would be one of the oldest and most powerful beings in this part of the galaxy. Right now, she was asleep. Owen had his datapad open, filing the Deck 4 maintenance request. He talked through it as he typed flow rates, sealed tolerances, the replacement part numbers he needed to order. Just his voice, moving through the warm evening air. Solen's ear tilted toward him. Behind him through the open hall, he could hear Suveth telling Orith the story. He caught pieces of it. The alarm Solen slept through, the debris field, the conduit that burned his hand. The moment a baby dragon pressed her nose to a ventilation screen and looked at a man who fixed air recyclers and decided, without ceremony or consideration, that she had found the correct person. Owen finished the maintenance request and set the datapad down. He put his hand on Solen's side, gentle and still, and looked at the mountains. He said, to no one in particular, that the altitude here would probably affect the intake pressure on any recyclers they had in the lower levels. He said he would check them in the morning. Solen breathed out once, slow and deep. She slept the way she always slept when he was near, perfectly, fully, without any alarm in the galaxy able to reach her. Except one. Owen leaned back against the warm stone and watched the light move on the mountains, and the stars come out above them, one by one, in the slow and patient dark.